I didn't know what to wear. That's a strange thing to admit for a guy my age. At 38, I can fix a busted sink and build a spreadsheet that predicts the cash flow of a parking garage down to the quarter. But there I was, standing in front of our bedroom mirror with two shirts in my hands. One a soft blue button-down I've had forever, the other a stiff new thing with a brand my wife liked, and trying to remember the last time I felt easy in my own skin. "It's just dinner," she said from the bathroom, like the words themselves were a solution. The hairdryer drowned out most of her tone, but I caught the shape of it. Casual, but not quite gentle. "We're the Navy. The other one looks, I don't know, lived in." "That's what makes it comfortable," I said. She stepped out, twisting her hair into a clip. "Right, but tonight isn't about comfort. It's nice. You know how my friends are." I did know. Not well enough to claim any of them, but well enough to recognize the choreography. The ritual hug, the wet cheek kiss, the scan of shoes to watch brand names march across the floor. I never fit in with them. Too simple, too practical. I'm a guy who keeps the tags on luggage so I can remember the dimensions. They're the kind of people who buy luggage that makes a statement. And somehow that difference, which used to make us laugh on the couch, had turned into a measuring stick I was always too short to meet. Still, I put on the Navy shirt. I tucked it in. Belt. The boots she bought me last year. They were expensive in a way that made me treat them like museum pieces. I stood back from the mirror and wished the stiffness I felt was only in the leather. She came closer, smoothing the fabric at my shoulders like a tailor. "Better," she said, and kissed my cheek. "You'll be perfect." Perfect carried a lot of freight these days. It didn't used to. When we were first dating, I wore my favorite flannel to meet her friends after work, and she leaned over my beer and whispered, "You look like a hug." We laughed about that for months. Somewhere along the way, the joke got filed under things we don't say anymore. I don't want to make it sound like she was cruel. She wasn't. She was stressed, stretched thin, ambitious in ways that made me respect her and scared me a little too. Her world kept moving. New clients, better addresses, friends who always seemed to be arriving from some airport with glowing skin and a funny story about an upgrade. My world moved too, just sideways. I work in property, leases, maintenance, slow deals that feel like setting stones in a river and trusting the current will find its way around them. The money is steady but not flashy. The work is quiet. That's always been fine by me. Lately, I could tell it wasn't fine by her. I think couples have a private language for this stuff, a dialect built from small looks and unfinished sentences. Ours had been changing. When she asked, "What did you do today?" there was curiosity, sure, but also a patience that sounded like a waiting room magazine. When I explained a tenant issue I'd been untangling, a freight elevator that needed a repair during business hours, she nodded, smiled like I'd told her a cute anecdote, and changed the subject to a rooftop opening someone's agency was sponsoring. I don't say this to blame her. I had my own part in it. I kept making myself smaller around her friends because it was easier than taking up space. I told myself I was being polite. Maybe sometimes I was being cowardly. I helped her with the clasp of her necklace. The little pendant flashed against her collarbone. I remembered the day I bought it, reaching for a card and feeling the bright, absurd hope that the right gesture could be a bridge over anything. "You look beautiful," I said. She smiled for real then, the kind that curled my ribs like warmth. "Thank you," she said, and touched my wrist. It should have been enough. It almost was. On the drive over, she squeezed my knee while she checked the time. "We might be a few minutes late," she said. "They'll be fine. Where are we going again?" She named the restaurant, the kind that has a bouncer for no reason except to make you feel grateful to be let in. I knew the building well, though she didn't know that I did. I've learned that owning something, paperwork and loans and insurance, doesn't make it feel like yours. You don't walk around in a dress with your arms out. You just carry the numbers in your head. I didn't volunteer this detail because the last time I tried to explain the scaffolding that holds a city up, she blinked like I was reciting a bedtime story and then told me about the dessert they were known for. My mistake wasn't caring about foundations. It was assuming anyone else would. Her phone lit up on her lap with a group chat. She tipped it away from me out of habit. I told myself not to notice. The little message bubbles popped in rhythm with the streetlights. "Almost there. Parking. OMG the menu." She typed back with her thumb flying. A laugh escaped her that wasn't for me, and I felt that small drift in my chest, the private language inching toward silence. Do you think you'll have fun? She asked, still looking at the screen. I want to, I said. That's not an answer. I watched the light change from red to green. I will if you're with me. She looked up then, and whatever was on her phone receded. Hey, she said softly. I'm with you. I believed her. Or I wanted to. Take your pick. The restaurant sat in the kind of building that shows up in architecture blogs. Old brick, big windows, a marquee that pretended it was still 1940. The lobby smelled like lemon polish and effort. We walked past the front desk and the elevator bank. She nodded at the hostess like they were part of the same guild. She walks into a room, and the room decides it wants to know her name. It's a gift. It also leaves a lot of people standing at the edge holding their hats, including me. We were the last to arrive. The table looked like a magazine spread. Candles, tall glasses, hair that catches light like silk. Her friends stood, and the hug circuit began. There's always a small game of charades in those first 30 seconds. Who do I hug first? How do I not step on the clutch of someone's designer heel? Where do I put these big, unsure hands? She seemed to read my discomfort and leaned into me, guiding me to my spot like a dance instructor steering the beginner. There, she said under her breath, and patted the back of the chair. The place cards were calligraphed like wedding invitations. I smiled at mine, the swirl of my name doing its best to dress me up. Across from me sat Oliver, who wears his jawline like an ID badge. Next to him, Maya, with a practiced laugh. There was also Serena, who hugged like she was allergic to touch, and Beth, who I liked in spite of myself because she asked follow-up questions when you told a story. There's a ritual opening at dinners like this. It's light, breezy, a volley that tells the waiter how fast to pour the wine. I can do that part. I can make a stupid joke and nod at the right moment. It's the next part that gets me, the gradual sorting of people into talkers and listeners, the way the talkers build scaffolds out of brands and places and drop them like names, the way the listeners gratefully hold them up. At least, that's how it felt to me sitting there with my navy shirt and boots I didn't trust. How was everybody's week? I tried. Oh my God, Maya said. We had this client fly in from Lisbon and he was just, and we were off to the races. I won't pretend I didn't enjoy some of it. People are people. A messy client story is a messy client story, no matter how expensive the shoes involved. But somewhere in the second glass of wine, I felt the tilt shift against me. It started small. Oliver glanced at my boots and said, "You went with suede? Bold choice for November." It was a joke, I think. But jokes are knives you hand someone and hope they know how to put them down. He did not. "Hey," I said. I was told these were dress boots. "By whom?" he said, smiling. "A catalog from 2018? Laughter. Quick, low, meant to be harmless. My wife's too." She squeezed my arm under the table and mouthed, "Play along." I tried. "I'll forward you the catalog," I said, and held up an imaginary phone like a prop. More laughter. My face felt warm. Later, Serena said my shirt had an everyman vibe. I said thank you, and she said, No, I didn't mean, but of course she did. The compliments were full of air like that, floating up and drifting off to wherever hurt feelings go. I watched my wife's smile get tighter. She caught me studying her and looked away. Then came the thing she said, the sentence that cracked something small and important inside me. It arrived as a sigh at first. The waiter had asked me a question about the specials, and I'd asked him one back. What kind of stock did they use for the mushroom risotto? Because I actually like to know how things are made. I was curious, not trying to be difficult. The waiter answered like a champ. I said thanks. The table restarted its conversation machine. She leaned toward me, the way people lean toward someone when they're about to request a private call in a noisy room. "Could you maybe not ask so many questions?" she said, barely above a whisper. "It's a little embarrassing." Embarrassing. She didn't say it with malice. She said it like she was helping me avoid a pothole, like I should be grateful she'd pointed it out. I felt the words settle in my chest like a coin that would never finish hitting the bottom. I opened my mouth to ask what, exactly, about me was embarrassing. But her eyes were already back with the group, tracking the next joke, the next shared reference. My question turned to steam and disappeared. I told myself to breathe. I told myself to be a grown-up and not make a scene. I told myself a lot of things. The private language in my head translated embarrassing into smaller, more survivable phrases. Maybe she's having a tough week. Maybe she's stressed. Maybe I was long-winded. Maybe. Across the table, Beth caught my eye. Her brow knit for half a second in something like apology. Then she looked away too. I have a bad habit of trying to fix discomfort with practical solutions. Something awkward happens, I head for a light switch. So I turned to Oliver and asked about a building I knew his firm was courting. A simple question: how are you thinking about the lobby layout? Because that's something I know. Concrete, HVAC, sidelines. Things you can untangle and leave in better shape than when you found them. He blinked like I'd addressed him in a dialect he didn't speak. The designer has a plan, he said, which might as well have been, why are you here? And maybe he had a point. The conversation swelled around me. I listened. That's a generous way of saying I sat very still and tried not to take up space. The waiter refilled my water like he'd been instructed to keep my glass at a precise level. I liked him. He had that combination of hustle and care that makes service look like a live performance. He checked on us without hovering. When I thanked him, he glanced at my face for an extra beat like he was trying to place me. I didn't think anything of it. Between appetizers and entrees, my wife went to the restroom with Serena. When she returned, her lipstick was fresh, and her smile lasted 2 seconds too long. She touched my shoulder as she slid back into her chair. An observer could have written a kind caption for the photo. Wife's hand on husband's shoulder, the choreography of care. But the hand felt like something staged, like a cue given to mark time until the next scene. I took a sip of water and almost asked the thing I'd been carrying for months. Do you still like me? Not love. Love was bigger than both of us, something that could be studied like a map and still misread. Like was more dangerous, more immediate. Do you like the way I think? The way I fill a room? The way I make conversation, not just with your friends, but with myself when I'm cooking eggs on a Saturday? Do you like me? But the table kept moving and I kept not asking. Instead, I said something about the building. Not the ownership, just the bones. You can feel the old beams in here, I said, almost to myself, running my hand along the edge of the table. They kept a lot of the original. You can tell from the spacing of the columns. Maya laughed lightly. Okay, Mr. Architect. I'm not an architect, I said, smiling because I didn't want to be precious about it. Just appreciate the work. Well, Oliver said, we appreciate people who appreciate it, right? He raised his glass in a diplomatic toast that managed to make my appreciation sound like a participation ribbon. Everybody clinked. My wife gave me a look under the rim of her glass that I couldn't translate. Half warning, half apology. I held on to the apology part because I needed it. Dinner settled into the predictable rhythm of a nice night out. The room glowed. The food arrived and disappeared. I relaxed a little, but it was the kind of relaxation you get in a dentist's office when they tell you the worst is over and then will in a different tray. I try not to let that feeling show. I tried to be the version of myself who used to be good at nights like this. The guy who could tell a story about getting lost in a parking garage and make it sound like an adventure. But that guy didn't show up. He must have taken a different elevator. If this was a movie, this is where I tell you I decided to do something dramatic. That I stood up on a chair and delivered a speech about how we measure worth, or that I flipped over the table and stormed out to the sound of gasps. I didn't. I sat there and listened and nodded and laughed when it seemed like laughter was required. I didn't even know I was waiting for anything until the moment arrived on its own, wearing a white shirt and a black apron, carrying a tray of coffee and desserts. The waiter set down the plates with the efficiency of someone who understands choreography, then bent toward me like he'd been holding a question too. By the way, he said, his voice pitched for me, but not secret. Thanks again, boss. It took me a full second to track what he'd said, and another 2 to understand that the table had heard it too. 3 pairs of eyes snapped toward me. One pair, the one I wanted to impress, kept moving, landing on my face like a bird on a slick branch, unsure whether to stay. The waiter smiled, oblivious to the tension he'd lobbed into the center of the table. That maintenance crew you sent last week? Lifesaver. Elevator hasn't purred like that in years. He moved on. The dessert spoons glinted. My throat was suddenly dry. Boss, Oliver said, eyebrows up, a little grin already forming. Did he just call you? My wife slid her hand off my shoulder, where it had drifted as if on a timer. It's complicated, she said too quickly. It's not, just eat the cake. But the word had already done what words do. It had opened a door I'd been careful not to advertise, not because I was ashamed of what was behind it, but because privacy is a habit in my line of work. You learn that bragging invites questions you don't want to answer and expectations you don't want to manage. You also learn that there are reasonable times to step through the door and say who you are. Maybe this was one of them. I set my spoon down and looked at her. Should I explain? I asked quietly. She held my gaze for a second, then looked at Serena, then at her plate. If you want, she said. Just keep it simple. Keep it simple. Embarrassing. Lived in. Everyman. The vocabulary of a person being gently shaved down into something that would fit better inside someone else's life. I picked up my napkin and placed it on the table. Sure, I said, more to myself than to anyone else. I can be simple. But before I said anything else, before I answered Oliver, before I pointed at the door and told them what was printed in clean black letters above it, the little crease between my wife's eyebrows deepened, and I knew something else was coming too. I just didn't know what shape it would take yet, or how far the ripple would reach when it finally hit. I glanced at the wall behind us, at the long room reflected in the antique mirror, and for a heartbeat, I saw us from a distance. A well-dressed group in a soft-lit restaurant. Laughter suspended in the air like glass, and me, in my navy shirt and careful boots, sitting at the edge of a moment that would bend something I couldn't quite name. That's the thing about a night like this. You think the story is just dinner. You don't realize until later that you were already halfway to a different kind of ending. Oliver was the first to speak, naturally. He had the kind of voice that liked to fill space, smooth, confident, with just enough feigned curiosity to hide the undercurrent of competition. So, he said, drawing the word out like he was testing its strength, boss. The table chuckled, not full-throated laughter, more like polite amusement in case the joke turned out to have teeth. I leaned back in my chair, my hand resting loosely on the stem of my glass. My instinct, my oldest, safest instinct, was to play it down, to say something like, "Oh, he's just being friendly," and let the conversation roll past me like traffic. That was what my wife would have wanted. She liked me in the background, dependable and quiet, the kind of man who didn't interrupt the flow. But something about the word embarrassing still lingered in my chest, an ember from earlier in the night. And the way her friends had snickered at my boots, and the way she had looked at me, not angry, not even annoyed, but like I was a piece of furniture that didn't match the rest of the set. I smiled, not big, not sharp, just enough to show I'd heard him. "He works for me," I said simply. The reaction was subtle at first. Maya's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Serena tilted her head, the way a cat does when it hears a sound it doesn't understand. Beth's eyes flicked to my wife's, searching for a cue. "Oh," Oliver said. "What do you do?" That was the question. The one that, if I answered it honestly, would change the temperature of the whole table. I'd spent years perfecting the short answer. Real estate management. Bland enough to kill follow-up questions. Safe. But I didn't feel like being safe. Not tonight. "I own this building," I said, gesturing casually to the high ceilings, the polished wood, the original brickwork that ran like veins along the walls, and a few others nearby. The silence that followed was one of those rare, crystalline moments when you can feel the air rearranging itself around you. It wasn't long, not even 3 full seconds, but I felt every tick. Maya blinked. Like, "Oh no." "Yes," I said. "Oh no." The waiter returned to pour wine for the table, and I caught the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He'd heard, and I could tell he knew exactly what kind of shift had just happened. "Wow," Serena said, leaning forward slightly. "That's impressive." Her voice had softened, as though she'd suddenly remembered her manners. Oliver wasn't ready to let it go. "So you're in property development?" "In ownership," I corrected, still keeping my tone light. "Development's part of it. Leasing, management, restoration. This place was a mess when I bought it. Structural issues, outdated systems. We put in new HVAC, rewired the electrical, reinforced the beams. That's why the elevator runs so quietly now." I glanced toward the kitchen, where the waiter was disappearing with empty plates. That's probably what he was thanking me for. I wasn't bragging. I was just telling the truth. But in circles like this, sometimes the truth feels like a flex. Across from me, my wife had gone still. Not frozen exactly. More like someone trying not to draw attention to herself while a glass tips over on the table. Her smile was fixed, but I could see the corners twitch. Maya finally broke the tension. "That's amazing. I had no idea." "You weren't supposed to," I said, and let the words hang there. The conversation stumbled forward after that, but the rhythm was different now. Questions aimed at me had a new tone, less teasing, more careful. When Oliver asked how I got started, it didn't sound like a joke. When Serena asked about other properties, there was genuine interest in her eyes. And my wife? She stayed quiet. She sipped her wine, laughed at other people's stories, but didn't add her own. At one point, Beth caught my gaze again and gave me the smallest nod, like she'd just seen the shape of the picture for the first time. I didn't push the moment. I didn't have to. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is say just enough, then let people sit with it. But inside, I knew part 3 of this story was still coming. Because I could feel my wife's discomfort building with each polite question her friends asked me. And I had a choice to make. Let it simmer quietly until dessert, or lean in and finish what the waiter had started. And I was beginning to think I might not choose quiet this time. Dessert arrived with the same elegance as the rest of the night. Slender plates set down on linen, spoons that clinked softly against porcelain, the faintest aroma of espresso trailing from the bar. I'd been quiet for the last 10 minutes, just watching. Watching the way Oliver leaned in closer now when he spoke to me. Watching how Maya's tone shifted from playful to almost deferential. Watching Serena nod thoughtfully, as if she'd suddenly realized my earlier comment about the beams wasn't small talk, it was expertise. And watching my wife. She hadn't looked at me since I'd said I owned the building. She was still smiling, but it was the kind of smile that isn't tethered to anything. The kind that's just teeth and duty. She laughed when she needed to, dabbed at her lips with her napkin, answered questions only when asked. When the waiter came back with coffee, he paused again by my shoulder. "Hope you're happy with how everything turned out, sir," he said. "The renovations really make this place what it is." I nodded. "I am. And thank you for running it so well. You and the team keep this place alive." He grinned, gave a small salute, and walked off. The table went still. There was no pretending now. Everyone knew there was more to the story than they'd assumed when I'd walked in wearing my everyman navy shirt. Oliver tried to recover first. "So, when you say you own the building, does that mean the whole block or just this property?" I stirred my coffee slowly, letting the spoon ring against the cup. "The block," I said. "This place, the boutique across the street, the offices above us. Even that wine shop a few doors down. Been building it piece by piece for years." Maya's jaw tightened just slightly, like she was recalibrating every thought she'd had about me tonight. Beth, bless her, just said, "That's incredible," and meant it. I looked over at my wife for the first time in a while. "Funny thing," I said, my tone still light, conversational. "We're actually sitting about 15 feet above my name." Serena blinked. "Your name?" I set my spoon down and gestured toward the back of the restaurant. "There's a cornerstone on the southwest side of the building, engraved during the restoration. My name's right there. You can see it from the sidewalk." Maya laughed nervously. "Like literally carved in stone?" "Yes," I said. "Literally." The silence that followed wasn't the comfortable kind. It was the shifting kind, where people start to look around, trying to piece together how they'd missed something so obvious. I could feel my wife's gaze now. Not warm, not angry, something sharper. Something like a warning, "Don't push this any further." But the thing was, I didn't have to push. The point had already been made. The rest of the meal passed in polite conversation, but I could tell none of them were really listening to one another anymore. Every now and then, a glance would flick my way, as if they were still adjusting the picture in their minds. The quiet, slightly out-of-place husband they'd been laughing at was the reason the chair they were sitting in even existed. When the check came, I waved the waiter over before anyone could reach for it. "On the house tonight," I told him. He smiled knowingly. "Yes, sir." That got their attention. Oliver opened his mouth, then closed it. Serena set her spoon down without finishing her dessert. My wife's cheeks flushed, not from wine. We stood to leave, and I held her coat for her. She didn't say thank you. Outside, the night air was cool, clean. The streetlight caught the engraved cornerstone just right. My name cut deep into the stone, the letters dark with shadow. I didn't point it out. I didn't need to. As her friends walked ahead, chatting in low, uncertain tones, my wife stayed beside me. "Finally," she said, "you didn't have to do that." I looked at her. "Didn't have to what?" "Make a scene." I smiled faintly. "I didn't make a scene. I told the truth." She didn't reply. We reached the corner, and her friends turned to say goodbye. Their smiles were smaller now, more cautious. They shook my hand a little too firmly, like they were making up for something they couldn't name. And then they were gone. I stood there for a moment, looking back at the building, warm lights spilling from its windows, the reflection of the engraved stone glinting faintly in the glass. Maybe they'd forget the meal. Maybe they'd forget the conversation. But they'd remember this. The man they'd called embarrassing was the one holding the ground beneath their feet. And that was enough for me.